So today's topic is a continuation of what we have been discussing the last couple of lectures, which is sustainability across cultures and through time. So we discussed the Maya in intensive farming society, what happened to them, and then looked at an example of rice-based polyculture in Bali. Today, we're going to move away from intensive agriculture or farming societies and look at an example of subsistence in the Amazon basin of South America. And so we'll be continuing to look at different examples of how human societies have interacted with their environment. How have they managed their resource base? One really important reason anthropologists stress comparison, cross-cultural comparison, why it's so important is because we often mistakenly assume that our culture, our way of life is natural or normal or somehow inevitable, which can be kind of depressing if you tend to see a lot of social and environmental problems today. But cross-cultural comparison shows us that our way of life is just one of innumerable ways of organizing a society around their environment. Alternatives do exist, and what can we learn from others to inform our own future directions in sustainability? So before jumping into that, let's talk for a moment about the exam 2, which is coming up next Thursday, a week from today. So it's essentially the same format as our in-class exams, except you have a several-day time period to take it. So exam 2 will be available next Thursday, April 16th, probably by about 5 o'clock, by 5. And then you need to complete and submit it between then and Sunday, April 19th, before the end of that day by 11:59 p.m. The idea in giving you several days to complete it is so that you can take it at a time that's convenient to you. A lot of us have children or other things going on. This is a new situation for all of us, so there's some flexibility built in there. It'll be about 35 to 40 multiple choice true-false questions worth 70% of the exam, and then the essay portion worth 30% of your score. So the essay question study guide is posted on Blackboard. I will pick one question from the study guide and put it on the exam. But you should study and prepare for all of the questions in advance. Not only for the essay portion, you should also study and prepare for the multiple choice section. You want to kind of take the test as you would prepare for the test the same way you would as if you were taking it in class. So you don't want to sort of start the exam and then try to search through your lecture and your notes for the answers. You won't have time for that. So study and prepare before you begin, and then prepare your essay questions in advance. If you do this, feel free to use your prepared essay responses to the question when you're taking your exam. I urge you to do so. So spend some time fleshing that out, and then come exam time, you've already got the essay portion nailed. On that note, make sure on the essay you use your own words. Otherwise, it'll be considered plagiarism. So since this is an at-home exam, it's by definition somewhat open book and open note because there's no way for me to moderate that. So when you write your essay, be sure you're using your own words. The rule of thumb is 3 or more words that are not your own, that come from another article or verbatim on my lecture. That's considered plagiarism. So just be sure to put it in your own words. And prepare in advance and use those outlines or prepared responses when you take the test. Go for it. A couple of tips. So again, prepare your answers in advance to the essays. When you write your answer, don't simply string together a list of loosely related facts and observations. Right? Illustrate it concisely and appropriately. Identify important concepts, and then go on to explain what that means. Why is it significant? Be sure to illustrate what you're trying to demonstrate with examples and details. Support the argument that you're making. Pretend like I don't know the answer to the question and explain it to me from that perspective. Be explicit and make sure you're connecting the different concepts you talk about. And then secondly, just review. Go through the material as many times as you need till it starts to stick. Okay, so we can talk more about the exam next week. If you all have questions, maybe we can open up the discussion board or even set up a study group on Zoom or something like that. So something to start thinking about. Study guide's up. Take a look at it, and then next week, if you have questions, we can talk about that. Okay, so today, sustainability across time and through space. We discussed the Maya, then rice-based polyculture in Bali, and today We're going to be looking at an example of environmental management among different groups in the Amazon. And the main subsistence strategy practiced there today is something called horticulture. So we're going to look at horticultural societies among others in the Amazon. First, more generally, what is environmental management? What do we mean when we say that? There's different forms of environmental management. First is environmental manipulation. This is the physical alteration of species and of ecosystems on a large scale. So for example, the terraced rice fields in Bali are a great example of large-scale environmental manipulation. There's also resource management. This is the smaller scale management of specific resources, such as a fishery or a forest. A good example of smaller scale resource management comes from the Orlov book that we're reading right now, Nature and Culture at Lake Titicaca. It's about the fishing villages around Lake Titicaca, and they have something called TERFs, which stands for Territorial Use Rights in Fishing. And what that is, it's a form of something called community-based resource management, which means the local resource users actually have control over the resources rather than the government or some sort of privatized entity. And keep reading it. We'll talk about it more as we go. The reason we're reading it is community-based resource management is an alternative to state or private forms of management. And also, the lakeshore villages in Lake Titicaca are a great example of long-term sustainable local resource use. The assumption is sort of that people will inevitably overexploit their resources. Well, that assumption comes from Western culture, where individualism and profit is valued. That's not necessarily true in other cultures. So the assumption is you have to privatize or nationalize the resource in order to conserve it. And in the process of that, we've disenfranchised a lot of communities from their livelihood base, from the resources and the places they've lived for a long time. And so community-based resource management is an alternative, sustainable one that works in some cases. It's often overlooked by Western scientists. It's something anthropologists sort of specialize in. So TERFs from the book we're reading, that's one good example of resource management. There are two general forms of environmental management and manipulation, and these are active and passive. All societies, both small scale and large scale, from the Kung to industrial, post-industrial societies like the US, all societies manipulate their environments. There's a often assumption in Western thinking that small scale indigenous societies simply made do with what nature provided, right? The Native Americans used every part of the buffalo. And as you're going to see today, that's not necessarily true. All societies, again, have had to organize around their resource base and provide for themselves. And all of them have manipulated the environments that they are in. It's not restricted just to large scale societies, large scale environmental manipulation. So active forms of environmental management manipulation, I'm using them synonymous now. Active forms are when people intentionally modify the environment for the purposes of subsistence, producing food. Different examples of active management include burning. For example, slash and burn agriculture. When you can see that pictured on the top in the slide along a river in Brazil. Societies or people will cut down a plot of forest and then burn all that vegetation. The ash from the burnt vegetation is then incorporated into the soil, adding valuable nutrients, fertility, reducing the pH, making it less acidic, and making it fertile for cultivation. We'll talk more about slash and burn later on today. Other active forms of management, simply clearing land without burning or slashing, just clearing it for cultivation. Also, other active forms, cultivating without clearing or burning land. So, for example, the Maya planted cacao groves among the forest, cultivated this within the natural landscape. There's also examples of fruit tree groves being planted in the forest. And constructed landscapes are another example of active management. So again, the Balinese constructed landscapes for rice-based polyculture is a great example. The entire landscape, entire hillsides have been modified, constructed to better suit human needs to produce rice in this case. The most common form of active management that we find cross-culturally is burning, slash and burn agriculture. And then there's passive forms of environmental management. Let me just back up real quick to active. There's one other example I wanted to give you of constructed landscapes. So the Balinese, terrace landscapes, and then also when we discussed the Maya, they had an example of something called swamp reclamation. And so in swamplands, they would practice something called raised fields, where they mound up the swamp muck into dry mounds. That's where you plant your crops. And then surrounding the mounds, there's water canals. Fish, ducks, other animals live in the canals, all defecating to add fertility, and also themselves serving as resources. Another thing about the Mayan swamp reclamation is it's a way to create a landscape where water is available via the canal system, even during seasons when rainfall is really low or non-existent. So it's another great example of active environmental management. Remember, the Maya actively worked to adapt to their environment, to produce for themselves. Okay, so passive then, passive forms of management is when aspects of a people's culture, like their religion or their rituals, serve to manage the environment and or their resources. So it's passive management because the actions, for example, religious ceremonies or rituals, they're not done directly for subsistence purposes. They're done in relation to the religion, ideological beliefs, etc. But indirectly, the effects of these rituals and beliefs is that they have advantages for the subsistence, the farming system in Bali. So remember, in rice-based polyculture there, the irrigation, the control of and timing of water is crucial to ensure all the subaks have enough water. Remember, the watering is staggered because water is landlocked in Bali, and so if everyone waters at the same time, there won't be enough. And so the timing of the rituals is what controls the irrigation timing. So again, the rituals are done in relation to the religion, but in this passive, indirect way, they have benefits for the farming system. There's enough water. There's also other benefits of this subak water temple system. So it's the rituals, the religious aspects of the Balinese rice farmers. Again, they're not designed to manage the farming system, but indirectly, the result is that they do help regulate irrigation. There's enough water for all subaks. Also, through staggering irrigation via the timing of the rituals, this controls for pests in their fields. If the subaks were all to plant at the same time and rice was growing all at the same time in the same stage of development, it'd be very easy for pests that feed on that species to come along and destroy it. So by staggering when the different subaks plant and then irrigate and cultivate, it breaks up cycles of pests. They have a much harder time sticking around feeding off the crop. So it's passive. It's not active like when someone sets out to burn a field down to create soil fertility to plant in it. And the question sort of becomes, are people completely unaware that their religious rituals have these advantageous effects on farming? And the answer is no, these people aren't stupid. We saw in the TED Talk by Steve Lansing, the Balinese recognize their traditional system as better than, say, the technology brought in by the Green Revolution, which caused all sorts of problems. But again, it's so they realize that it has beneficial effects, but it's passive in the sense that, again, the rituals are done for the religion, but indirectly this is beneficial for the farming system. They're probably aware of that. Also importantly, just in general, in cultures where people, typically small-scale societies, non-Western societies, in cultures where people rely directly on their environment for survival, it tends to generate beliefs and practices that don't generate wholesale destruction on the environment that their survival depends on. So they tend to be overall more sustainable systems. They can respond to the feedback in their environment should their actions have a detrimental effect. And also note, for example, in the Balinese system, how much it lets nature do the work, right? The ducks control for pests. They also add fertility to the rice paddies. Just by staggering irrigation, you don't need herbicides, you don't need pesticides, you don't even need fossil fuels or fertilizer. You can cut all that out just by working with what nature has already sort of figured out, staggering irrigation to provide for everyone, to control for pests. So we're going to look at a specific example of environmental manipulation among small-scale societies and large ones in the Amazon basin. So on the slide is just a pictured is the distribution of tropical rainforests around the world. And the Amazon in South America is one of the largest tropical regions in the world. If you go to the Amazon today, contemporarily, this is what most contemporary indigenous Amazonian societies look like. They tend to live in small, impermanent villages, maybe up to a couple hundred residents, maybe less, maybe a little more. They have multifamily residences, meaning you don't live just with your nuclear family, but with the extended family. They practice swidden or slash and burn agriculture, meaning that they'll slash and burn fields, plant for a couple of seasons until the fertility is exhausted, and then move on to a new plot, slash and burn that. They cultivate bitter manioc. It's often used in rituals that exalt intoxication. It has to do with the religion. So they cultivate that. They use canoes because they're riverine oriented. So canoes are the main way to sort of travel and transport resources around. They tend to sleep in hammocks, not beds. They make pottery, again, exalt intoxication in their rituals, and live in this sort of tropical rainforest, riverine type terrain. They also move around. They're semi-nomadic because they practice swidden agriculture. After they've sort of exhausted the land surrounding their village, it becomes more and more difficult. You have to go further and further to get to your field. And so eventually they'll move the whole village to a new site. These types of societies that I just described are classic examples of what anthropologists refer to as simple societies, meaning that they're simple in the sense it's an organizational term, not a value judgment. They have complex knowledge about the natural world, intricate, deep ecological knowledge about their immediate environment, but they lack the hallmarks of civilization, of complex society, centralized government, large urban settlements, and economic production beyond household or community subsistence. Say, for example, production for the market. They lack these hallmarks of complex societies. And just one note on the word simple here. The italics are to draw attention to how we mean it in this context. And simple versus complex is not a value judgment. One is not better or worse. What it refers to is the degree of technological and organizational complexity. So think bureaucracy in our own society or industrial fossil fuel farming. These are way more complex than, say, hunting and gathering or big man leadership. They take way more steps, but it doesn't really mean that they're better or superior, right? In many cases, we might even tend to think the opposite. So these are, Amazonian societies are the quintessential simple societies, small groups that merely sort of make do with what nature provides. That's the assumption. And so archaeologist Betty Meggers wrote about the Amazon and this notion of the Amazon being a counterfeit paradise. What she said, what she sought out to answer, is why didn't complex large-scale farming societies like the Maya, the Aztecs, or the Inca develop in the Amazon basin? All these other cultures are in South or Central America, North America, but why not in the Amazon? And her answer is that the Amazon basin suffers from environmental limitations. You can't practice agriculture there. There's limits to how much food you can produce in the soil. And so without being able to practice farming, this limits a society's ability to develop into further complexity, right? Remember, agricultural surplus is the root of social complexity. Surplus allows for occupational stratification. You don't need everyone procuring food. You just need a few farmers to produce enough for everyone. Surplus. This allows other people to specialize along occupational lines. They start to accrue differences in status, differences in wealth over time, eventually leading to social stratification in different classes, right? And even centralized and hereditary leadership. So agricultural surplus is the root of all the rest of that complexity. She said in the Amazon, the soil has limited agricultural potential. You can't grow crops in it because it's infertile. The reason intensive agriculture isn't possible here, why the soil is so infertile, is because of high degrees of soil leaching. Basically, high rainfall removes all the nutrients out before plants can get to them. And so Megar said she calls the Amazon a counterfeit paradise. And it means it appears lush and green and fertile, but the soil is actually so infertile that this fertility is an illusion. It's counterfeit, it's fake. You can't actually grow anything in the soil. So why can't you grow anything in tropical soils? From the outside, they seem ideal for plant growth. Lots of rainfall, also plenty of sunshine, but they're not because the soil is completely infertile. So in tropical forests, they have high rainfall, a minimum of 60 to 80 inches a year. Again, this is ideal for plant growth, but the problem is the high rainfall also leads to demineralization and a leaching of the nutrients and fertility from the soil. It creates infertile soil. Basically, what leaching is the loss of water-soluble nutrients that plants need to grow. And so in other words, nitrogen and many other nutrients that plants need to grow are water soluble. Instead of the plants in the tropics being able to take these nutrients up from the soil, the high amount of rainfall carries the nutrients and minerals further and further deeper into the ground, and so they're not accessible to the plants, the crops. Basically, heavy rainfall dissolves the nutrients out before plants can get to them. Again, this is why Meggers calls it a counterfeit paradise. Despite the lush vegetation, making it looks ideal for plant growth, you can't actually practice agriculture or grow anything in the soil. And so just to sort of illustrate the difference between tropical versus temperate deciduous forest soil, on the right is tropical, on the left is deciduous. And so in tropical climates, the organic matter, the decaying plant and animal material that would normally fertilize the soil, because of all the heat and the moisture, it decomposes really, really quickly and is recycled back into the system extremely quickly. So in the tropics, the types of species, the trees and plants that grow there, they've adapted to this type of climate. And the way that they compete for available nutrients is their roots don't grow down because there's nothing in the actual soil. Instead, the roots grow out in these large, shallow mats that stay on the surface of above the soil, so that as decaying organic matter begins to enter the soil, the roots can take up those nutrients before they enter the soil and are leached out by high rainfall. In temperate forests, tree roots, as you can see on the right, they just grow straight down. In a temperate forest, a lot of the nutrients, the decomposing humus, plant and animal material, is just retained in the soil because there's not as high of rainfall. And so plants can take up these nutrients almost at their leisure. They stay in the soil. On the other hand, again, the heat of the tropics makes everything decompose really quickly, and then the rain threatens to carry it away. So again, in the tropics, the roots grow outward to develop this thick mat to catch the nutrients before they're leached out. In deciduous forests, the roots just grow down. They take up nutrients at leisure. And so if you were to cut down, let's just say, an acre of deciduous forest, you could plant immediately in that soil because there's so much nutrients still in it. If you try to do that with tropical soil, you clear an acre of land, you can't grow anything in that soil. Again, because there's no nutrients in it. Plants take the nutrients up before they even hit the soil. Once they hit the soil, the rainfall leaches them right out. And this is one reason why slash and burn is so common in tropical areas, because again, the soil's infertile. So the slash and burn strategy adds fertility to the soil for a couple of harvests. So we see a lot of contemporary Amazonian societies practicing that today in the tropics. Okay, and so Meggers said because of the environmental limitations, specifically limited agricultural potential because of infertile soil in the Amazon, intensive agriculture would not have been possible. Right? So there's no way, this is why she says large-scale complex farming societies like the Aztecs or Maya didn't develop in the Amazon, because you can't practice intensive agriculture. You therefore can't produce enough food surplus to support complex society. She says another alternative could have been swidden, slash and burn agriculture. They're synonymous. But the problem with that is swidden agriculture can't support large populations. You have to leave so much land fallow to let it regenerate and regrow before you can slash and burn it again. It requires a ton of land, and so you can't support large population densities with it. And so Meggers uses Marajó Island in Brazil as an example of how and why tropical rainforest environments can't support complex societies. So just to show you where Marajó is on the map in the northeast coast of South America and Brazil, and then the topographic map on the top, just to give you an idea of the terrain. So what she said, Megger's argument, and remember, she's an archaeologist. She said that in Marajó, there is archaeological evidence of a complex society. It's evidenced by a few different things, and one of the main lines of evidence she uses is complex pottery that's buried, that's been deposited in the archaeological record. Intricate, detailed, very specialized, ornate, different types of pottery. And she uses complex pottery as a proxy for social complexity. Like complex pottery doesn't exist among hunter-gatherers. Everyone's involved in getting food. It's only with agricultural surplus that frees people up to specialize in other occupations that you can get sort of this intricate pottery. And so she uses that as a proxy to say complex society existed here, but they didn't evolve in place here. She suggests that they came probably somewhere from the Peruvian highlands and immigrated into the area to try to colonize it. And it reflects all the trappings of complex civilization, evidence for social stratification, pottery, art, job specialization. Again, all these sort of hallmarks of complex civ. She says once they moved into the area, though, complexity of the society starts to decrease over time. So remember, Megger says agriculture, intensive ag is limited in the Amazon because of rainfall and soil leaching. And that's true. And so she assumes hunting and gathering was probably the main subsistence strategy of this immigrant group that came over to Marajó. And at first, it would have been really easy to feed everyone with the abundance of game and plant populations, deer, fish, different plants. But over time, these animal and plant populations would become diminished. And more people would need to abandon their specialized occupations, like pottery or whatever, to become involved in producing food. And so eventually this continued to happen. People did eventually abandon their specialized occupations, became involved in food procurement. And you can see evidence for this in the archaeological record, right? The abandonment of specialization is shown in the pottery, so the deepest layers in the archaeological record, the ones lowest down, that represents older time periods. And as you move up, that represents younger time periods. And so the deeper you go, the more complex the pottery is. As you move up into the younger and younger layers, the artifacts, the pottery that's deposited, you see this consistent decline in complexity and intricacy and detail until it disappears altogether. So she uses that to argue that the complexity of the society diminished over time because they couldn't support the population with intensive agricultural surplus. And eventually, with the breakdown in the division of labor, specialization, which is the basis for different social classes and stratification, we also see a disintegration of the social system. And the evidence for this, for the disappearance of stratification, different social classes, is in the burial sites. So as you move from the older to the younger layers in the archaeological record, initially during older time periods, there's this differential treatment of the dead. So it's evidence for different social classes. For example, those higher on the social ladder might have really ornate burials. They'd be buried with a bunch of grave goods, possibly, precious stones, whatever's valuable to the society. And the skeletons themselves might reflect better health or even status symbol modification like teeth inlays or skull shape, which is indicative of upper classes. Versus like commoner burials where maybe they're buried with nothing or a couple of pots or a tool or something like that. And so as you move through the arc record to younger time periods, Megger says the differential treatment of the dead also disappears. And it makes sense, right? It's a good argument. It makes sense. Essentially, her conclusion is that a more advanced group moved into Marajó. They were complex, but ultimately they failed over time and died out because of the agricultural limitations of the area. When productivity is limited, when you can't produce surplus, you can't support large populations, and all the other things that come from that, right? Specialization, stratification, centralization, etc. And so you see the whole society as a whole, complexity declines over time until the group basically abandons the region about 500 years ago. And she says complexity continues to decline till it's in line with environmental limitations. So it's a good argument. It's provocative, makes sense, but recent data shows that Meggers was likely wrong, and that actually Amazonian societies indeed supported large complex populations, but a different type of complexity. It wasn't the monumental architecture and the centralized urban cities that we see among the Maya or Inca or Aztecs. However, there's lots of evidence of pre-Columbian, meaning pre-colonial, networked permanent plaza communities organized in a nested hierarchy. So meaning they're sort of centralized urban centers connected to other lesser urban centers. Also dispersed urban settlements, so settlement around these urban areas. Towns with thousands of people and a regional population of 50,000. That's not small scale. And there's also evidence of extensive landscape modifications with moats, roads, and bridges connecting the urban centers. I have a few pictures on the next slide of the data, examples from pre-Columbian polities of the Upper Xingu. And the Upper Xingu River is in the same general area as Marajó. And there are two other things about Meggers' argument that are problematic. And again, it's an interesting argument. It makes sense, but the evidence doesn't really support it, especially as more recent evidence has come out. First, new radiocarbon dates show that the Marajó people of Marajó were actually there a lot longer than she had estimated, like 900 years longer than she thought. So this degeneration of culture over this short period of time is not really supported anymore. Although there is evidence that change occurred here. This group that Meggers talks about, they probably weren't immigrants. And secondly, another problem is she generalized this argument of limited social complexity due to limited agricultural productivity to every tropical environment. And that's just not true. There's now evidence of quite complex societies in tropical environments. This is just to show you the polities of the Upper Xingu. I know it's kind of hard to tell from the slide, but the citation is there if you're interested in looking into how they do this in archaeology. On the right, you can see evidence of permanent plazas, residences, and groups or polities organized in this sort of nested hierarchy. Again, it's not really well shown just from the picture, but the citation's here if you are interested. And kind of same idea here, documenting extensive and highly planned road systems, canals, bridges, even walled towns and other structures and infrastructure. And so it suggests a much higher degree of complexity occurred in this region than what Meggers initially said. And Meggers basically said this couldn't happen here. It appears that it has. Adding to this urban settlement, evidence for infrastructure, etc. Could the Amazon basin support large complex societies? And these large Amazonian earthworks are another piece of evidence that suggests, yes, absolutely. This is not the Kung. This is not hunter-gatherers making these large geometric earthworks. There's been over 200 of these discovered now in an area that extends from northern Bolivia to southern Amazonia. So it shows these are well-planned, extensive urban centers with large populations. So the Amazon basin can indeed support cultural complexity and large populations. It's still true that you can't practice intensive agriculture here, though. So the question becomes, how were these large, complex societies sustained in the Amazon? And to understand this, we need to explore horticulture in more detail. And horticulture is also variously referred to as shifting cultivation, where you sort of shift different plots as you exhaust the fertility of the land you've been cultivating. And it often involves, it doesn't have to, but it often involves slash and burn or swidden cultivation, where not only do you rotate plots, but you burn that plot down, incorporate the ash into the soil, which adds valuable nutrients, also makes the pH less acidic, which is good for plant growth. And that allows you to grow crops for a couple of harvests on that plot with that added fertility from the ash. Until the fertility's been exhausted, you have to move on and slash and burn a new plot. And so it's still true what Megger said, that the soil in tropical rainforests in the Amazon can't support intensive agriculture. It's too infertile. The nutrients are leached out by high rainfall. So how were these large populations sustained? A little bit more just about horticulture. Horticulture is a subsistence adaptation, just like hunting and gathering or intensive farming or industrial farming. So horticulture today is the basis of subsistence for contemporary Amazonian groups. If you go there today, this is what you will see. This is what most of the societies look like. They practice horticulture, sort of gardening, and they plant fields, not large scale like intensive agriculture, but small fields, maybe an acre to 2 acres. They'll clear the area, then burn all the vegetation, incorporate that ash into the soil, and then plant crops for a couple of seasons. The burning removes the vegetation, so it clears the land for cultivation, but it also adds nutrients to the soil, and increases the pH from the ash. It makes it less acidic. And the ash in general has carbon in it, which is a critical limiting nutrient in plant growth. And actually, just on that note, any sort of burnt vegetation, all you pot smokers, I never said that, but you can use that ash or any type of burnt vegetation and incorporate that into the soil of your garden or your house plants, and it puts valuable carbon into the soil. It works. I've seen people experiment with it. A friend of mine. After you do this, after you plant for a couple of harvests, you have to abandon the field and leave it fallow for up to 10 to 20 years. The fertility from the ash goes away within a few harvests, and then you can't really grow anything in it. So you have to let the field regenerate, and then eventually you come back, slash and burn it again after a long fallow, and then you can harvest for a couple seasons again. It takes less labor than intensive agriculture, say compared to rice-based polyculture, where you need people working constantly. If they stop working on those terrace systems, it'll turn into a muddy hill slope in a week. So less labor than intensive agriculture, but swidden or slash and burn requires lots of land for plot rotation. Again, you have to leave the fields fallow after 1 or 2 harvests for 10 to 20 years. So you need lots and lots of land to do this. And because of that, swidden horticulture, you can only support relatively low population densities when compared to intensive agriculture. You just can't produce as high of a yield out of the same unit of land because you're not intensifying your efforts beyond sort of the slash and burn and incorporating the ash in there. Versus industrial agriculture, where we're spraying pesticides, herbicides, fossil fuels, fertilizer the whole time to squeeze a little more yield out. And so you get a little bit of fertility for a few seasons, and then you got to move on and do another field. So you can't support large populations with this subsistence strategy. Here's just the world distribution of where we see horticultural subsistence strategies around the world. And note it's conducive to specific environments, sort of tropical and semi-tropical areas. Horticulturalists, compared to agriculturalists, their diet is more diverse than farmers. They rely on several different plants and sources of food. They usually supplement gardening also with hunting or fishing. This is in comparison to sort of monocropping, where 1 or 2 species of, namely cereal grains, are planted. So the diet is overall more healthy. There's a bunch of micronutrients and minerals that they get from this diversity of different resources they rely on. Also, by relying on several different species for subsistence, it reduces their risk. It makes them more resilient in the face of change or climatic fluctuations or pest infestations. If something goes wrong with one of their gardens or one of the resources they typically use, no big deal. They have B, C, D, E, F, G to rely on. In contrast to farmers with monocropping, we've sort of put all our eggs in one basket. If something goes wrong, large-scale famine might be the result. So it's overall more resilient compared to intensive agriculture. And it allows for, I guess it's always a relative when we say larger communities, but communities larger than hunter-gatherers, because there's a slightly more permanent food supply. They're modifying the land to an extent. And so households are clustered in communities of up to 500 people. They're also semi-nomadic, meaning they move from time to time, maybe every couple of years, maybe every couple of decades. Again, because they practice slash and burn, the longer they're in one village site, the further out from the village they have to go to slash and burn a new plot. And eventually you have to go so far, it's not really worth the effort. It's this diminishing returns. So eventually they'll just move the entire village site to a new area, or an old past village site where the fallow fields have regrown, and then they'll start over there. And the social organization is still largely egalitarian, meaning there's no real sharp stratification like how we have in our society, where you are on the social ladder could be the difference between nutrition and healthcare, sort of life and death. And so they're more egalitarian than that, but there is some gender inequality, gender stratification, typically men being elevated over women. And there's also a little bit more for, a little more concrete leadership. This achieved status of sort of being headmen or bigmen of the village. So it's achieved and earned. Your leadership is based off ability and charisma. So people are listening to you because you're making decisions that are good for the group. That's also reversible. So if you become an asshole, you're no longer the headman. Labor is divided by age and gender, as it is in any society, right? Younger versus older people, men and women often have different tasks. This is what societies look like today if you go to the Amazon. Slash and burn, 500 people. And so there's this big debate. Again, they practice slash and burn today, but was swidden horticulture possible before the introduction of steel from Europeans? So the question is this a recent invention or an ancient tradition? How long have they actually been practicing slash and burn in the Amazon? So let me just read you, just so you can see what goes into the swidden cycle, the 6 stages of the swidden cycle. And the point is, it's a lot of fucking work. First, the large trees are cut down, a male task, leaving fruit trees standing. Although much of the debris is cleared, large stumps and fallen trunks are usually left where they are. 2, the cut growth is then burned, a task that has to be undertaken before the rainy season. The burning of the vegetation not only clears the ground for planting, but releases nutrients. The ash provides potassium and improves the availability of calcium and magnesium. As the burned material decays, the organic levels rise, boosting the soil's fertility. 3, planting must begin almost immediately before the ash bed is blown or leached away and before the heavy rains cause soil erosion. This is a communal task, usually accompanied by ceremony and ritual. Shallow holes are made by men using dibble sticks, while the women follow behind, dropping a few seeds into each hole. Next step, regular rains lead to rapid growth and also the emergence of weeds whose seeds have been blown and carried to the site or which are already lying below the surface. This must regularly be removed to prevent them taking nutrients away from the crop. During the harvesting period, farmers will usually live in their fields, protecting the crop from animals. Traditional finger knives are still used in many areas for harvesting grain. The best seed from the crop is retained for next year's planting. Almost done. The land will be left fallow to revert to forest after 1 or 2 harvests. Within about 10 years, a closed canopy of secondary forest will have been established, after which the level of nutrients will have been restored sufficiently to allow the swidden cycle to be repeated. So it's a shitload of work. The main question becomes, was swidden possible without metal tools? And so there was research actually done to compare the efficiency of swidden with stone versus steel tools, because prior to colonialization, pre-Columbian times, they didn't have steel, they just had stone. And so chopping down, using stone, to chop down 1 4 diameter tree took 115 hours of work. That's like 3 weeks of 8-hour days to chop down a tree. So with that, a typical field, like an 1.5 acre field, would take about 153 8-hour days. I'd take, a little less than half a year to chop down a field. And that's just part of the cycle, right? You haven't burned it or planted it yet or cultivated it yet. That's stone. Take a look at with steel. Steel, a 4 diameter tree cut down in 3 hours versus 115. And so with this, a typical field would take about 8-hour days. It would take a little over a week versus almost half a year. Because of this, the consensus now among scientists is that swidden is a recent invention. Slash and burn is common there now, but it wasn't before colonialism. And it's a recent invention caused by 2 key things: the introduction of European steel tools and also old world diseases. So first of all, old world diseases like smallpox led to a massive population decline in the Americas. And this is likely why we see such small Amazonian populations today, right? Disease is said to have depopulated anywhere from 90 to 99% of indigenous societies, often before they even came into contact with their colonizers, right? Because the disease spreads ahead of the people. So old world disease depopulated the area. This is why we see much smaller communities today. And with less people around, swidden all of a sudden becomes a lot more viable because it can support lower population densities. So you have less people, more available land, and you don't need to feed as many people. Swidden's now viable, and with the introduction of steel tools, um, again, it became viable. You couldn't have done it with stone tools. So small populations and slash and burn today are a result of old world diseases depopulating the area and steel being introduced. So these pre-Columbian large, complex Amazonian populations that Meggers thought couldn't exist, but we now know did. It's still true that they didn't subsist on intensive agriculture, and they also could not have subsisted via slash and burn agriculture because you can't support large populations and you need steel to do it. And both of those hadn't occurred yet. So how are these large pre-Columbian Amazonian populations actually sustained? And the answer seems to be what is called a domesticated landscape. The domestication of landscape refers to the conscious process by which human manipulation of the landscape results in changes in landscape ecology and the demographics of its plant and animal populations, resulting in a landscape more productive and congenial for humans. And so these large, complex pre-Columbian Amazonian societies were indeed modifying their environment on a large scale. They were not just making do with what nature provides. How did they achieve a domesticated landscape? And there's two examples I have for you to illustrate this. Remember, domesticated landscape, making the environment more conducive to human use, either providing food or resources or whatever. And so the two examples are managed forests and also something called Amazonian dark earth or terra preta do Indio, which means sort of black earth of the Indian in Portuguese. So first, managed forests. Forests weren't cleared in the Amazon for cultivation. Rather, they were replaced. And so instead of allowing all the whatever naturally occurring species that may or may not be useful to humans, they replaced a lot of those species with species that were useful, either for food or other resources. They planted manioc, other selected tree crops. So it looks like a natural forest, but it's actually human modified and human created, anthropogenic. And one of the main selected tree crops that we find there is the peach palm. Just some facts about the peach palm as a resource, a very valuable resource. It's loaded with nutrients and highly caloric oil. And remember, corn and some of these other cereal grains, they are deficient in key vitamins and amino acids. The peach palm also has protein. It's also more productive in terms of yield than rice, beans, or maize, in the sense that you get more food for the same amount of input from the peach palm. And the trees start producing after just 5 years of being planted, and they will continue to produce for up to 70 years. The peach palm was originally domesticated in the Amazon, but then it spread throughout the neotropics to other areas. And groups that subsist on the peach palm use it as a resource, say that it's valued so much that only wives and children are held in higher regard. And actually, the Amazon might in fact be a giant orchard. If you look at the plant inventories in the Amazon, it shows half of all ecologically occurring species are used by humans for food. This is what half, 50% of those species are used by humans. That's way more than by chance. People were intentionally modifying, manipulating on a large scale the environments in which they lived. Up to 20%, up to a fifth of the Amazon forest might actually be anthropogenic, meaning human modified. What looks like the epitome of untouched nature, the fucking rainforest, is actually human created. It's anthropogenic. It wouldn't look the way it does without human activity, human modification, and manipulation over time. So what looks like nature actually anthropogenic, at least parts of it. And this idea of nature is going to get really interesting when we start our next section after the exam on conservation policies, conserving natural resources and pristine nature. For example, with like national parks. And the second example I have for you of domesticated landscapes here is something called Amazonian dark earth, or Terra Preta do Indio, which in Portuguese means black soil of the Indian. The soils date to up to 2,000 to 2,500 years before present. So they were created sometime 1,000 to 2,500 years ago. Interestingly, correlated with the soil is also archaeological evidence for mound building in these areas. Mound building is beyond the purview of our class, but it's indicative of complex society. It indicates a division of labor. And so this Amazonian dark earth, this anthrosol, human-created soil, is probably one way in which Amazonian cultures were able to sustain large populations. And if you look at the picture on the left is the nutrient, here, on the next one. On the left is this nutrient poor acidic soil that's typical of tropical environments, called oxisol. And that sort of reddish color is from aluminum toxicity. You just can't grow shit in it. On the right is the terra preta, and look at how rich and dark and black that looks, just teeming with nutrients for plant growth. It's really, really rich soil. A little bit more about terra preta, some facts. Amazonian dark earth, terra preta, I'm using them synonymously, are an exception to the nutrient-poor acidic soils that characterize most of the tropics. These soils have approximately twice the amount of soil organic matter, which has nutrients in it, and higher concentrations of phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, zinc, and manganese, all limiting nutrients in plant growth. These ADE soils have up to 64 times more charcoal than do typical Amazonian soils. Why does charcoal matter? So in slash and burn, you burn the vegetation and incorporate the ash into the soil. It adds nutrients, reduces pH. Great, it works for a few harvests. With charcoal, it does sort of all of the above, but the charcoal is then incorporated into the soil. And instead of nutrients and microorganisms being leached out by high rainfall, they get in, they stay in the pores of the charcoal. They get held in the soil by the charcoal, making it really, really fertile. These patches of this type of soil occur all over the Amazon, anywhere from 5 to 300 hectares, so up to like 3 square miles big, some of them. And it's estimated about 10% of the Amazon basin, an area the same size as France, is composed of these terra preta soils. And so they're not an accident. These ADE soils are an intentional result of permanent large prehistoric communities working to improve the quality of their environment for farming. They occur in the Amazon and also in areas in West Africa. Just a couple of facts on how productive these soils actually are. When the productivity of plants grown on ADE soil was contrasted with typical oxisol, the Amazonian soils, maize yields on the terra preta were 63 times greater. Weed cover was 45 times greater, and plant species diversity was up to 11 times greater than the adjacent typical Amazon soils. Because it's so much more fertile, there's more growth and more biodiversity, and it makes the overall ecosystem in the soil more productive and efficient in terms of nutrient recycling and waste recycling. A little more about Amazonian dark earth. It has 3 times the nitrogen and phosphorus and 20 times the carbon of normal Amazonian soils. So scientists aren't exactly sure how indigenous people created terra preta. Their techniques remain somewhat enigmatic. We don't really know for sure. But what we think is terra preta was formed through something called slash and smolder or slash and char horticulture rather than slash and burn. So with slash and burn, you burn everything down, you incorporate the ash, it gives you fertility for maybe 1 or 2 seasons of plant growth, and then you have to move on. With slash and smolder, you don't burn all the vegetation. You char it, you create charcoal. You then incorporate that biochar material, the burnt vegetation, into the soil. And one of the results is instead of releasing most of the carbon like burning does into the atmosphere and only putting a little of carbon back into the soil via the ash, with slash and smolder, when you are not burning it but charring it, it releases very little carbon into the atmosphere, but it makes the carbon in the vegetation locked into a bioavailable form in the charcoal for other plants to then uptake once the charcoal's in the soil. And so essentially the charcoal holds all these micronutrients and other minerals that plants need in the soil, preventing them from being leached away from the high rainfall. Just to give you an example of how, and well, and one other thing. So with slash and burn, you'd be, it takes a lot of land and you only get a few growing seasons out of it. So without steel, and with large populations, it's just not a viable strategy. With slash and smolder, however, pre-Columbian times, even though it would still be a lot of work, especially with stone tools, you can grow on these plots of Amazonian dark earth for way longer than you can grow on a slash and burn plot, because that choil, that charcoal and that richness of the soil is so great compared to a typical slash and burn field. And so it's worth, even though it still take a long time to create the soil, it's really worth the effort because the return on it is huge. You can continue to plant in it, because it's so fertile. Just to give you an example of the difference between typical tropical Amazonian soil and terra preta, 1 hectare of meter deep terra preta can contain 250 tons of carbon. This is opposed to 100 tons of carbon in the unimproved normal Amazonian soils. What does that mean? To understand what that means, the difference in carbon between these soils matches all of the vegetation on top of both of them. That's how much richer terra preta is compared to the oxisol. Another thing that's kind of cool and maybe will be used in the future is with the slash and char that creates the terra preta, we think, they're not releasing that carbon into the atmosphere, so you're not increasing CO2 emissions. And also by locking the carbon into the charcoal and providing it for plants, it's essentially, these ADEs serve as a carbon sink. So you could actually eliminate the need for fertilizer and reduce carbon emissions in the atmosphere at the same time by using this technique, for example, to grow crops in. And up to 10% of the Amazon is terra preta. Pre-Columbian Amazonian societies made their own soil. They actively worked to modify their environments on a large scale. And so we started this talk with this idea that intensive agriculture is not possible in the Amazon. Megger said it's a counterfeit paradise. It looks lush, but high rainfall and high leaching means you can't actually grow crops there. And because of this, she argued these areas couldn't support large populations or social complexity. However, we now know that large-scale complex societies did exist here. And so the key question is, again, how are they supporting themselves? They weren't practicing intensive ag, that's true. Swidden would not be viable with large populations and without steel. And so the answer seems to be, again, these domesticated landscapes. Humans modified their environments to make them more conducive to providing food and resources for them. And the two examples, again, are the managed forest, the peach palm, and also terra preta, this Amazonian dark earth. And so one of the really key points is that small-scale societies or non-Western societies did not and do not merely just make do with what nature provides. They are not merely at the mercy of their environment. They actively modified, created and adapted their environments. They created and adapted nature, if you will. What looks like and is tropical rainforest, the Amazon, save the Amazon, it looks like that because of anthropogenic activity, human modification. It's in part human created. The assumption in Western society is that large-scale societies always result in wholesale destruction of their environments. And that's simply not true. And here's a great example of how large-scale complex societies subsisted in the past. And so, in the Amazon, again, to summarize, plant inventories show half of all the ecologically occurring species are used by humans for food. Moreover, up to 20% of the Amazon rainforest might actually be anthropogenic, human created. And also, these societies made their own fertile soil. 10% of the Amazon is made of terra preta. And so, given what we've talked about and these facts about the Amazon, right? Half of the species that occur there are useful to humans. That's a lot more than by chance. 20% might be an orchard, and 10% of the soil is human created. So given this, and the fact that large portions of the natural pristine rainforest are in fact anthropogenic, the question I have for you is, what is nature? And so what I would like you to do, usually we have this discussion in class and it's one of my favorites. So I'm hoping we can have a bit of a discussion on Blackboard, on our discussion board about this. By the time you are hearing this lecture, the discussion board will be open for you to answer this question. And the question is simple, it's not a trick, there's not a right or a wrong, this is for discussion purposes. What is nature? People often operate subconsciously on assumptions about how the world works. And we don't often realize it, right? It's subconscious to it. And so what do we mean when we say nature? What is it? How do we define it? I want you to give me a definition. What is it? So when you now or sometime soon, in the next few days, jump on Blackboard on the discussion board and answer this question. You can answer it in a few words, up to a sentence or two. Don't do more than that. And again, it's not a trick question. Just give me a definition. What is it? Explain it, right? We talk about it all the time. We should be able to say what it is. When we say that word, what do we mean? So what you should do, get on the discussion board, answer the question in a few words to a couple of sentences max. And after that, I encourage you to also engage with the definitions that other peers in the class have provided. Kind of like a class discussion, but we're going to do it on Blackboard. And so, no, you don't have to engage with other people's posts. I'm not, going to critique you for that, but I encourage you to contribute where appropriate and relevant. So if someone's saying something similar to what you said, but you want to add to it, or you want to seek clarification or add a point or ask a question, jump in. We should be talking and interacting with each other. Not all of you just writing something and me, responding. So as a class, so provide an answer and then feel free to sort of jump in with what others are also saying. I will also jump on the discussion board and help moderate and definitely probably play devil's advocate. And so to encourage you guys to participate, you're not required to do this, but I'll give you up to 2 points of extra credit to your overall score for the course. 2 points may not seem like a lot, but at the end of the semester, that's 0.5% of your final score for the course. So it could be a difference between a B and an A C and a B, etc. So you should go give me a definition, see what you come up with, and see what others come up with, and then we'll all talk as a class. Don't overthink this, right? Spend a couple minutes thinking about the question, and then give me a brief definition of it. Don't randomly post just try to earn points, please. If you want to do it, but don't just sort of write on there just so I see your name and give you points, because I won't. And also just make sure that we are respectful to everyone else in the class. Keep it professional, keep it courteous, don't make it personal, okay? So I hope you jump on the discussion board. What is nature? Let's talk about it, and I'll throw you some points for getting engaged. And it's actually a really interesting discussion anyways. So with that, jump on the discussion board and tell me, What is nature? We talk about it all the time. We should be able to say what it is, right? All right, I'll talk to you guys one more lecture before the exam. I hope you all have a great day or night or morning, depending on when exactly you are actually watching this. Cheers.